I am Kate, and I've spent my 72 years as a mother, wife, and grandmother. My life was quiet, predictable even. Tom and I had built a life together in our cozy suburban home in Chicago. For over 4 decades, we shared everything: joys, struggles, triumphs, and sorrows. When Tom died suddenly from a heart attack, I was left with just the echoes of our shared life. The house, now quieter, felt hollow without him. My days became a routine of reading, tending to the garden, and holding on to memories that slipped further away with each passing day. The only physical reminder of him was the Rolex he gave me years ago. I wore it every day, not because it was valuable, but because it connected me to him. And now, it was all I had left of our life together. Outside my little world, the neighbors had all but forgotten me. The connections I once had, the relationships that helped fill the space between me and the world, had begun to fade. Slowly, they turned into distant waves in the distance, no longer the close-knit ties they had once been. But that was okay, I suppose. I had always been self-sufficient. Tom used to joke that I didn't need anyone to take care of me, and now, I had nothing but time to prove it. And my son, Michael, once told me that there was always enough love in our family to get by. But somewhere along the way, something changed. It wasn't just the years or the fact that we had both aged. It was the slow realization that my family saw me differently now. I wasn't the mother who was needed as much anymore. I was an afterthought. Michael had become distant long before Tom's death. At first, I tried to blame it on the stresses of his job, the demands of raising a family, or his busy schedule. I understood, after all, I had raised him alone for many years after his father's passing. But as the years wore on, I began to feel like I was nothing more than a burden. I remember how it all started, how things began to shift after Tom passed. Michael was still in that period of transition, where the guilt of losing his father was fresh, and the demands of his own life seemed overwhelming. At first, I thought it was just grief, that he would eventually find his way back. But instead of leaning on me, instead of calling for comfort, he distanced himself further. Jamie, his wife, was the first to suggest I should consider living in a retirement home. Her tone, always so sweet, never failed to make my heart twist with a sting of betrayal. "It would be good for you, Mom," she'd say, her voice coated in forced kindness. "They have activities, people to talk to, and you wouldn't be alone." The first time she brought it up, it was almost casual, as if she were offering a suggestion for a new brand of shampoo, something harmless and convenient. But I could hear the underlying message in her words: "You're getting old, and it might be time to make a change." At first, I brushed it off. "I'm fine," I said, maybe too quickly, but the words came easily. I was fine. I had the garden, the books, my walks around the neighborhood, everything was manageable, even without Tom by my side. But Jamie, with her own life and her own busy world, didn't understand. And perhaps she never would. Michael, on the other hand, took a different approach. His words, though not unkind, felt like a subtle dismissal. "Maybe it's time for you to let go of the past, Mom," he would say, eyes glancing away as though he were saying something that could easily be brushed aside. But it wasn't just the words, it was the attitude that came with them. It was as if I had outlived my purpose. As if my memories, my shared history with Tom, and everything I had contributed to Michael's life no longer mattered. I couldn't help but notice the distance growing between us. He would only call when there was something he needed, advice on a decision, or occasionally to check in. But there were no more long conversations about our shared love of books, no more talks about the past, no more late-night conversations about family, life, and love. He was busy, I told myself. He had his own family, his own life, and I should be happy for him. But when the calls became shorter, when the text messages lacked any real depth, when he stopped offering me the comfort of his presence, I couldn't shake the feeling of being left behind. I wasn't the mother I used to be to him. I was now the person he occasionally checked on, a fixture in the background that didn't seem to need much. Over time, I came to realize that I wasn't as important as I used to be. And that hurt more than I could put into words. It wasn't just Michael. It was Jamie too. She had always been the cheerful, bubbly presence in the family, the one who made everything feel bright and easy. But as the years passed, I could see the subtle change in her, the way she began to view me as a bit of an inconvenience. It wasn't overt. It wasn't cruel. But there was something in the way she spoke to me, the way her eyes seemed to gloss over whenever I shared something personal, that told me everything I needed to know. She didn't really see me anymore. I was just a background character in the story of their lives. One Sunday afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the phone in my hand. Michael had called, but it was a brief, emotionless conversation. "How's everything?" he asked, and I could tell he was distracted. I could hear the background noise, his children fighting over a toy, Jamie talking in the kitchen. He didn't wait for my answer before he abruptly said, "All right, Mom, we've got to go. Talk soon." I sat in the silence that followed, the weight of his words settling like a heavy fog in my chest. It was becoming painfully clear that the family I had devoted my life to was slipping away from me. It wasn't that they didn't love me, it was more that they simply didn't need me anymore. They were busy living their own lives, and I was a relic of a past time, no longer a priority. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and silent. I would walk from room to room, the footsteps echoing off the walls as if they were in a home I no longer recognized. The photos of Michael and his family, once cherished on the mantel, began to feel like relics from a past life. The house was filled with memories of a time when things were different. And it hurt to realize how far I had drifted from the life I had once known. Then, there was Tom's watch, the Rolex. It wasn't just an expensive gift, it was a symbol. Tom had given it to me on our anniversary, just before Michael was born. "For the woman who will always be my one constant," he'd said, his voice low and warm as he slid the watch on my wrist. That was more than a decade ago, and yet it had always felt as if Tom's love remained in that simple gesture. Every time I glanced at the watch, I was reminded of the love and stability he had brought to my life, and I had always cherished that connection. Now, it was all I had left of him, this one tangible reminder that he had been here, that we had shared something beautiful. I wore it every day, not because it was valuable, but because it connected me to him. It was the only thing that truly belonged to both of us, something that no one could take away. Yet, even that seemed to be slipping through my fingers. Michael had always been practical, but I never expected him to be so dismissive of something that meant so much to me. In the months leading up to the sale, I had noticed subtle hints of how little my feelings seemed to matter. Jamie would make comments, dismissing things I held dear. And Michael, who once respected my memories, was now less attentive, less interested. The Rolex wasn't just a watch, it was a part of me, a part of my life with Tom, and I couldn't understand why they were so eager to remove it from my hands. "Would you like me to continue with the next part, or would you like to adjust something?" I had long dreamed of a trip to Italy. It had always been on the list of things Tom and I would do together once we were free of the responsibilities that came with raising children and managing our busy lives. We had talked about it for years, joked about the vineyards we would visit, the little cafes we would sit in, and the cobbled streets we would stroll down hand in hand. Italy was going to be our final adventure, the kind of trip we would take when time finally slowed down, and we could relax and savor the moments we had left. But Tom's death shattered that dream. Suddenly, I found myself alone in a world that had once been shared. The trip to Italy, the one we had planned, was now a cruel reminder of everything I had lost. The longing for those moments we would never have, for the life we would never live, became a constant ache in my chest. I would imagine myself walking through the ancient streets, but Tom's absence was like a shadow, following me wherever I went, pulling me back from the future I had envisioned. The reality of the situation hit me harder than I expected. For months, I couldn't bring myself to even look at the travel brochures we had once picked out together. They sat untouched in a drawer, a reminder of the plans we would never see through. I had pushed those feelings down, buried them under the daily routines of life. But still, the grief lingered. In an attempt to distract myself from the emptiness, I found solace in small things, reading, gardening, and taking long walks through the neighborhood. The world outside my house kept turning, moving forward, while I stood still in time, anchored by memories of Tom. And then, something unexpected happened. Michael and Jamie, my son and his wife, announced they were going to Italy. At first, I thought it was a joke. Surely, they wouldn't be so thoughtless as to go on the trip we had dreamed of, without even considering how I might feel. But then I realized that it wasn't a joke, it was real. Michael and Jamie had planned their own holiday to Italy, a lavish vacation complete with their children, staying in 5-star hotels, visiting the top tourist spots. They were going without me. I couldn't believe it. I thought, for once, they would include me. I had always been the one to take a back seat to their plans, always the one to stay home, the one who never asked for much. But Italy, that was different. That was the trip Tom and I had always talked about. I had thought that, at the very least, they would invite me to join them, if only out of courtesy, if only because I was still family. But when I raised the subject with Michael, the response was flat and dismissive. "Mom, we're going to have a great time, but we think it's best if you stay here," he said. The words felt like a blow. There was no warmth in his tone, no understanding, just a matter-of-factness that left me cold. I tried to mask the hurt, to pretend that it didn't matter, but inside, I was crushed. Michael, who had once been my little boy, now treated me like an inconvenience. He had his family, his plans, and I no longer fit into that picture. His dismissive attitude was a slap in the face, but I kept my composure. I didn't argue, didn't plead. Instead, I nodded and quietly accepted that I wasn't wanted. It wasn't the first time I had felt this way, but it was certainly the most painful. Jamie, of course, was more than happy to join in the conversation. "It's just that it's such a long flight, and we really want to have some quality time as a family," she said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You know how it is with the kids. It's easier if we don't have to worry about anyone else." Her voice was saccharine, too sweet to be genuine. But what could I say? I wasn't going to beg them to include me. Instead, I told myself that it didn't matter. It wasn't their fault I was alone, wasn't their fault I had lost my husband, wasn't their fault they were living the life I had once imagined for myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling of being abandoned, of being left behind. Again. And then came the real blow, the one I hadn't seen coming. A few weeks after they returned from their trip, I was cleaning out some old drawers in the study when I found an envelope I wasn't expecting. It was a letter from a pawn shop. My hands went cold as I opened it, and I saw the words, "Payment received for Rolex watch. Thank you for your business." I froze. The words seemed to blur as my mind raced to understand what I was reading. My heart sank. The Rolex, the watch that Tom had given me, the one I had worn every day since his death, was gone. Sold. Without my knowledge, without my consent. I hadn't even known it was missing. The watch had been sitting on my dresser, just where I had left it after Michael and Jamie's trip. I never thought to check it, to make sure it was still there. How could I have known? I hadn't expected them to take something so precious from me, not without a word, not without any consideration for how much it meant. The watch wasn't just an object, it was a connection to Tom, a symbol of everything we had built together. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the letter still in my hands, trying to process what I had just read. I wasn't angry at first. I was numb. The hurt was so deep, I couldn't quite grasp it. Why would they sell the watch? How could they do that without even telling me? The Rolex had been Tom's gift to me. It wasn't just an expensive piece of jewelry, it was a part of him, a part of our shared life. But they had sold it. And they hadn't even considered my feelings. Michael and Jamie's lack of empathy was what stung the most. I had raised Michael with love and care, given him everything I had, and this was how he repaid me. By taking away the last piece of my life with Tom. By selling it to fund a trip they knew would hurt me. It was as if they had erased my connection to Tom, erased my place in their lives, and replaced it with their own selfish desires. I wanted to scream, to confront them, to demand answers. But I knew it wouldn't do any good. They didn't see it the way I did. To them, it was just a watch. To me, it was everything. I couldn't stay quiet about it forever. The Rolex had been a part of my life for so long, and now it was gone, just like Tom. I needed to know why they had done it, to understand how they could treat me like this. I had to reclaim my dignity, my sense of self-worth. I couldn't allow them to take everything from me. That day, as I sat alone in the study, staring at the letter in my hands, I made a decision. I couldn't stay in this house anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I was constantly being pushed aside, constantly being made to feel irrelevant. I would sell the house, move to the city, and start over. I would reclaim my life, and I would find out the truth behind the sale of that watch. I needed answers, and I was going to get them. I had spent years taking care of everyone else. Now it was time to take care of myself. And so, I began making plans. I would sell the house, find a new place to live, and rebuild my life. The watch may have been gone, but it wasn't going to be the end of me. I was stronger than they realized. I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I would find a way to heal, to move forward. And nothing, not even my family's betrayal, would stand in my way. The days that followed the discovery of the Rolex's sale were a blur of emotions, a whirlwind of anger, grief, and humiliation. Every time I glanced at the empty spot on my dresser where Tom's watch had once sat, it felt as though another piece of my past had been erased. The loss wasn't just of the watch itself, but of everything it represented, my love for Tom, our shared history, and the life we had built together. That watch had been a constant reminder of him. The simple act of looking at it every day grounded me in our memories, and now it was gone, without so much as a second thought from the people I had spent my life caring for. I had never felt so small. It was as if the foundation of my existence had been pulled out from under me, leaving me adrift in a sea of empty space. I was no longer important enough to be included in their plans, nor was I valued enough to be respected in my own home. Michael and Jamie's actions were the final confirmation of everything I had feared, that I had become a burden, someone to be discarded, someone whose feelings didn't matter. I had spent so many years supporting my family, pouring my love and energy into raising Michael, building a life with Tom, and keeping our home running smoothly. And now, after everything, it felt as though all of that was meaningless. My contributions had been forgotten, my sacrifices unnoticed. It wasn't just the loss of the Rolex, it was the realization that I was no longer a priority in my own family. I wasn't even an afterthought. I was invisible. The anger I felt toward Michael and Jamie was overwhelming, but it was tempered by an even deeper emotion, humiliation. I had been humiliated, not just by their actions but by my own inability to stand up for myself. For years, I had let them take me for granted, let them treat me as if I were unimportant. But this was something different. This wasn't just about neglect, it was about betrayal. They had taken something precious from me, something that had been given to me with love and care, and they had sold it as if it were nothing more than a trinket. How could they do that to me? I thought about confronting them, about demanding an explanation, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. Michael and Jamie had already shown me who they were. They weren't the people I thought they were. If I confronted them, I would only be met with indifference or, worse, dismissal. So, instead, I sat with my grief and my anger, nursing my humiliation in silence. The hardest part was not the loss of the watch, but the realization that they didn't even see how much it mattered to me. To them, it was just an object, a luxury item to be pawned off for a vacation. They had no understanding of what it meant, no appreciation for the years of love and history that were wrapped up in that simple timepiece. But the anger I felt toward them began to turn inward. How had I let this happen? How had I allowed them to take me for granted for so long? I had spent my life taking care of everyone else, always putting their needs before my own. I had been the caretaker, the nurturer, the one who kept the peace. But in doing so, I had neglected myself. I had allowed my family to treat me as if I didn't matter. And now, here I was, humiliated, betrayed, and left with nothing but the emptiness of a house that no longer felt like home. I stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman staring back at me. She was older, yes, but that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was the way she looked, small, diminished, and defeated. I had never seen myself like this before. I had always been strong, capable, someone who could weather any storm. But now, after everything, I felt as though I had been broken. I had given my family everything, and in return, I had been discarded like an old, worn-out coat. I couldn't stay like this. I couldn't let Michael and Jamie's actions define me. But what could I do? How could I reclaim my sense of self-worth after everything that had happened? I thought about Tom, about the way he had always made me feel cherished and valued. When he was alive, I had felt seen, important, loved. But now, with his absence, I felt invisible. I couldn't let this be the rest of my life. I couldn't let them take everything from me, not my memories, not my dignity, not my future. That night, I made a decision. I was no longer going to be the woman who quietly accepted whatever scraps were thrown my way. I was no longer going to stay in the background, hoping for scraps of attention from my family. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. It was time to take back control of my life. The first step was the hardest. I picked up the phone and called a real estate agent. I didn't want to sell the house, but I knew it was the only way forward. The house had become a tomb, a place filled with memories that now caused me pain. I needed to move on, to leave behind everything that reminded me of the family I had once known. The agent agreed to come by the next day to assess the house, and as I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control. The following morning, I walked through the house with the agent, discussing the market value, the repairs that needed to be done, and what the house would sell for. As I stood there, looking at the rooms where Tom and I had spent so many years together, I felt a deep sadness, but also a sense of liberation. This house had become a prison. Every room was filled with memories of a life that no longer existed. And now, it was time to let it go. The agent told me that the house would sell quickly, and that I would be able to move on to a new chapter in my life. It felt strange, almost like I was closing a door on the past. But I knew it was the right decision. I couldn't stay here, in this house that had once been filled with life and love, and now only reminded me of everything I had lost. But selling the house was just the beginning. I needed more than just a change of scenery. I needed to find out what had happened to the Rolex. I needed answers. Why had Michael and Jamie sold it? And what was the real reason they had excluded me from their plans? I needed closure, and I wasn't going to get it from them. But maybe, just maybe, I could get the answers I was looking for in a different way. I made an appointment with a lawyer to look into the sale of the Rolex. I didn't know what, if anything, could be done. But I had to try. I needed to know who had bought the watch, how much they had paid for it, and whether there was any chance of getting it back. It wasn't just about the watch, it was about reclaiming my dignity. I had been humiliated by my family, and I wasn't going to let that humiliation define me. The lawyer's office was quiet and sterile, but as I sat across from him, I felt a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. I was no longer going to be the passive observer in my own life. I was taking action. I wasn't going to let them get away with what they had done to me. Let's see what we can find, the lawyer said, as he typed on his computer, pulling up records from the pawn shop. The next few days were filled with phone calls, paperwork, and a lot of uncertainty. But as I waited, I felt a spark of hope. I was finally taking charge of my life. I was finally doing something for myself. As the weeks passed, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of hope. Selling the house had been the first step, and while it was a painful decision, it was also a necessary one. The house had become a tomb, a place filled with memories that, once cherished, now only brought pain. Each room held echoes of Tom, and though I had once thought it would be my sanctuary, it had become a reminder of everything I had lost. Now that I was preparing to leave, I could feel myself shaking off the weight of the past, step by step. But it wasn't just about moving out of the house. It was about reclaiming my sense of self. I was no longer going to be the woman who quietly accepted everything that came her way. I had spent too many years sacrificing my own happiness, too many years putting others first while losing sight of who I was. Now, it was time to take control of my life and my future. The decision to sell the house was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way forward. The days following the real estate agent's visit were filled with practical matters, packing, organizing, and saying goodbye to a place that had been my home for so many years. Yet, amid the physical work of preparing to move, there was a sense of freedom slowly taking root inside me. That's when I started thinking about the life I wanted to build. I didn't want to be a passive participant anymore, waiting for things to happen. I was done with that. I had spent so many years waiting for Michael, Jamie, and the rest of the world to validate me, to appreciate me, and I was always left feeling hollow and forgotten. But no more. I was done waiting. I was going to take charge of my own destiny. I thought about what I had once dreamed of, long before Tom's death, long before the grief, the loneliness, and the abandonment. I had always loved the idea of living in the city. The energy, the culture, the possibilities, it had always intrigued me. But Tom and I had chosen the quiet of the suburbs for our family. He had always been the one who grounded us, who kept us rooted. And while I had been content, I had also put aside my own dreams, my own desires, in favor of building a family life with him. Now, with Tom gone and my relationship with Michael and Jamie in tatters, it felt like the right time to finally pursue something just for me. I didn't know what exactly the future would hold, but I was ready to find out. I would sell the house, buy a small apartment in the city, and begin a new chapter of my life. I had always been the one to support others, now it was time to support myself. I didn't rush the decision. I spent days browsing listings, looking for the perfect place, imagining myself in each space. I wanted a place that felt like mine, something fresh and new, where I could build my life on my own terms. It wasn't about luxury or status, it was about finding a space where I could breathe again, where I could find peace. When I found the apartment, I knew it was the one. It wasn't large or fancy, but it had a charm that spoke to me. The windows were big, letting in plenty of light, and the kitchen was just the right size for cooking meals in solitude, as I had always enjoyed. The apartment felt like a blank slate, a place where I could finally begin again. While I went through the motions of finalizing the sale of the house and moving into the city, my mind kept drifting back to the Rolex, to the betrayal I had felt when Michael and Jamie had sold it. The lawyer had been diligent, pulling up the necessary records, but so far, there had been no leads. I wasn't sure if I would ever get the answers I was hoping for, but I knew I had to at least try. Even if I couldn't reclaim the watch, I needed closure. I needed to understand why they had done it. One afternoon, I sat in my new apartment, sipping a cup of tea and staring out the window at the city below. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. I had let go of the house, and though I hadn't completely let go of the past, I was learning how to move forward. I knew there was still work to do, work on myself, work on my relationships, work on finding a new sense of purpose. But I was no longer paralyzed by fear or anger. I was ready to live again. That's when the phone call came. It was the lawyer. I picked up the phone, already knowing what it was about. He had found something. The Rolex had been sold, but the sale had been a little more complicated than I had thought. The pawn shop had sold it to an online buyer, a private collector who had paid a premium for the watch. The lawyer was able to track down the buyer's information, and while I didn't expect to recover the watch, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I had answers. The buyer was based overseas, and though the chances of getting the watch back were slim, the lawyer assured me he would make an inquiry. He also informed me that, legally, there was little I could do to recover the Rolex without a substantial legal process, one that could take months, maybe even years. But I didn't care. For the first time, the truth mattered more than the object itself. The watch had been sold without my consent, but so was the truth that Michael and Jamie had no right to take it from me. And that realization was enough. I had my answers, and it was time to move on. I didn't need the Rolex to feel connected to Tom. His memory was with me in every breath I took, in every quiet moment I spent reflecting on the life we had shared. The watch had been a symbol, but the true symbol of our love was in the way I carried his memory with me, in the way I had learned to live without him. The Rolex was gone, but the essence of Tom was still there, inside me. As I began to settle into my new apartment, I realized something important. The life I was building now wasn't a replacement for the life I had with Tom. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about honoring it and learning to live with the loss. I wasn't going to let Michael and Jamie, or anyone else, define my future. I was going to do it myself. I started taking yoga classes, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I began volunteering at a local community center, helping others in ways that made me feel connected to something larger than myself. I joined a book club, something that felt like a small act of rebellion against the years of neglect I had suffered. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my sense of self. I still thought about the past, still felt the sting of betrayal, but I wasn't going to let it define me anymore. I had spent my life living for others, but now it was time to live for myself. The humiliation, the hurt, and the anger, they weren't going to control me anymore. I was going to take my life back. The next morning, I set up an appointment with a lawyer. I wanted to find out everything I could about the Rolex, about what had happened to it, and about what legal recourse I had, if any. It was more than just about getting the watch back, it was about reclaiming my dignity. I had been humiliated by my family, and I wasn't going to let that humiliation define me. As I walked into the lawyer's office, I felt a sense of resolve wash over me. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my own family, strip me of my sense of self. I was stronger than they thought, and I would find a way to make sure they knew it. The days ahead promised a future I would create with my own hands. Every moment in my new life became a building block, a life reclaimed, a future of my own design that in the weeks following my move to the city, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of hope. Selling the house had been the first step, and while it was a painful decision, it was also a necessary one. The house had become a tomb, a place filled with memories that, once cherished, now only brought pain. Each room held echoes of Tom, and though I had once thought it would be my sanctuary, it had become a reminder of everything I had lost. Now that I was preparing to leave, I could feel myself shaking off the weight of the past, step by step. But it wasn't just about moving out of the house. It was about reclaiming my sense of self. I was no longer going to be the woman who quietly accepted everything that came her way. I had spent too many years sacrificing my own happiness, too many years putting others first while losing sight of who I was. Now, it was time to take control of my life and my future. The decision to sell the house was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way forward. The days following the real estate agent's visit were filled with practical matters, packing, organizing, and saying goodbye to a place that had been my home for so many years. Yet, amid the physical work of preparing to move, there was a sense of freedom slowly taking root inside me. That's when I started thinking about the life I wanted to build. I didn't want to be a passive participant anymore, waiting for things to happen. I was done with that. I had spent so many years waiting for Michael, Jamie, and the rest of the world to validate me, to appreciate me, and I was always left feeling hollow and forgotten. But no more. I was done waiting. I was going to take charge of my own destiny. I thought about what I had once dreamed of, long before Tom's death, long before the grief, the loneliness, and the abandonment. I had always loved the idea of living in the city. The energy, the culture, the possibilities, it had always intrigued me. But Tom and I had chosen the quiet of the suburbs for our family. He had always been the one who grounded us, who kept us rooted. And while I had been content, I had also put aside my own dreams, my own desires, in favor of building a family life with him. Now, with Tom gone and my relationship with Michael and Jamie in tatters, it felt like the right time to finally pursue something just for me. I didn't know what exactly the future would hold, but I was ready to find out. I would sell the house, buy a small apartment in the city, and begin a new chapter of my life. I had always been the one to support others, now it was time to support myself. I didn't rush the decision. I spent days browsing listings, looking for the perfect place, imagining myself in each space. I wanted a place that felt like mine, something fresh and new, where I could build my life on my own terms. It wasn't about luxury or status, it was about finding a space where I could breathe again, where I could find peace. When I found the apartment, I knew it was the one. It wasn't large or fancy, but it had a charm that spoke to me. The windows were big, letting in plenty of light, and the kitchen was just the right size for cooking meals in solitude, as I had always enjoyed. The apartment felt like a blank slate, a place where I could finally begin again. While I went through the motions of finalizing the sale of the house and moving into the city, my mind kept drifting back to the Rolex, to the betrayal I had felt when Michael and Jamie had sold it. The lawyer had been diligent, pulling up the necessary records, but so far, there had been no leads. I wasn't sure if I would ever get the answers I was hoping for, but I knew I had to at least try. Even if I couldn't reclaim the watch, I needed closure. I needed to understand why they had done it. One afternoon, I sat in my new apartment, sipping a cup of tea and staring out the window at the city below. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. I had let go of the house, and though I hadn't completely let go of the past, I was learning how to move forward. I knew there was still work to do, work on myself, work on my relationships, work on finding a new sense of purpose. But I was no longer paralyzed by fear or anger. I was ready to live again. That's when the phone call came. It was the lawyer. I picked up the phone, already knowing what it was about. He had found something. The Rolex had been sold, but the sale had been a little more complicated than I had thought. The pawn shop had sold it to an online buyer, a private collector who had paid a premium for the watch. The lawyer was able to track down the buyer's information, and while I didn't expect to recover the watch, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I had answers. The buyer was based overseas, and though the chances of getting the watch back were slim, the lawyer assured me he would make an inquiry. He also informed me that, legally, there was little I could do to recover the Rolex without a substantial legal process, one that could take months, maybe even years. But I didn't care. For the first time, the truth mattered more than the object itself. The watch had been sold without my consent, but so was the truth that Michael and Jamie had no right to take it from me. And that realization was enough. I had my answers, and it was time to move on. I didn't need the Rolex to feel connected to Tom. His memory was with me in every breath I took, in every quiet moment I spent reflecting on the life we had shared. The watch had been a symbol, but the true symbol of our love was in the way I carried his memory with me, in the way I had learned to live without him. The Rolex was gone, but the essence of Tom was still there, inside me. As I began to settle into my new apartment, I realized something important. The life I was building now wasn't a replacement for the life I had with Tom. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about honoring it and learning to live with the loss. I wasn't going to let Michael and Jamie, or anyone else, define my future. I was going to do it myself. I started taking yoga classes, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. I began volunteering at a local community center, helping others in ways that made me feel connected to something larger than myself. I joined a book club, something that felt like a small act of rebellion against the years of neglect I had suffered. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my sense of self. I still thought about the past, still felt the sting of betrayal, but I wasn't going to let it define me anymore. I had spent my life living for others, but now it was time to live for myself. The humiliation, the hurt, and the anger, they weren't going to control me anymore. I was going to take my life back. The next morning, I set up an appointment with a lawyer. I wanted to find out everything I could about the Rolex, about what had happened to it, and about what legal recourse I had, if any. It was more than just about getting the watch back, it was about reclaiming my dignity. I had been humiliated by my family, and I wasn't going to let that humiliation define me. As I walked into the lawyer's office, I felt a sense of resolve wash over me. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my own family, strip me of my sense of self. I was stronger than they thought, and I would find a way to make sure they knew it. The days ahead promised a future I would create with my own hands. It had been a few months since I moved into my apartment in the city, and while the weight of the past still lingered, I was beginning to feel like a new version of myself, stronger, more independent, and, most importantly, in control. I had learned to enjoy the little things in life, to find comfort in the rhythm of my own days. Yet, despite the newfound sense of peace I was building, I knew there were things still unresolved, unfinished conversations, broken bridges, and the undeniable pull of my past. The phone call from Michael had come as a surprise. At first, I had almost convinced myself it was a fluke, some fleeting moment of guilt or obligation that had prompted him to reach out. It had been months since we had spoken, and I hadn't expected him to call any time soon, especially given how things had ended between us. But there he was, on the other end of the line, apologizing, trying to explain, and offering an olive branch in the form of a promise to repair what had been broken. It was a complicated feeling, to be sure. I had spent so many years longing for that kind of acknowledgement, for the recognition that I wasn't just some background figure in their lives, someone who could be easily cast aside. And now, when it finally came, I wasn't sure how to react. Was it too late for reconciliation? Had the damage already been done, so deeply ingrained that nothing could fix it? "Mom," Michael said softly on the phone, the usual edge in his voice gone. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About how things have been, about the way I treated you. And I just want to say, I'm sorry. I know I've let you down. And I know it's not enough, but I want to try. I want to rebuild what we've lost." His words hit me in ways I wasn't prepared for. After everything, I had almost convinced myself I was better off without them, without their empty promises, their assumptions about what I needed, their dismissive attitudes. But hearing his voice, hearing the genuine sorrow in it, made me feel something I hadn't expected, a tiny flicker of hope. "I don't know what you expect from me, Michael," I replied, my voice cautious, careful not to give in too easily. "You can't just call me after months of silence and expect everything to be fine. You've done things that can't just be undone with words." "I understand," he said, and for the first time in a long time, I heard him take responsibility for his actions. "I know I can't fix everything just like that. I just want you to know that I've thought about it. I've been thinking about how I've treated you for a long time now. It wasn't right. And I know it hurt you. And I'm truly sorry for that." There was a pause between us, a long, heavy silence that made me feel like I was standing at the edge of something, uncertain whether to take a step forward or stay where I was. "You don't know how much you've hurt me, Michael," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "It's not just about the Rolex, or the way you treated me when Dad died. It's about all the years I spent trying to hold everything together for you, for your family, while I was slowly being pushed aside. I loved you, and I still love you, but I can't keep giving and getting nothing in return." "I know, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I know I've lost your trust, and I understand if you need time. I don't want to lose you. I want to be there for you, like I should have been all these years." I sat back in my chair, staring out the window of my apartment. The city buzzed around me, but in that moment, everything seemed still. I had worked so hard to get to this point, to carve out a life that was mine, away from their expectations, away from the hurt. The thought of letting them back in, of risking that peace I had fought so hard for, was terrifying. I couldn't deny that Michael's apology had stirred something inside me, a longing for the family we once were, for the connection we used to share. But I also couldn't ignore the pain, the betrayal, and the countless times I had been dismissed, overlooked, or taken for granted. Could I really forgive him? Could I even trust him again after everything that had happened? "I can't promise anything, Michael," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "I need time to think about this. I've been hurt too many times, and I can't just let that go because you say you're sorry. But I will think about it. I will consider what this means. But don't expect me to just forget. I understand, he said. And I'm not asking you to forget. Just know that I'm here, and I want to try. Whenever you're ready. The conversation ended not with closure, but with a sense of something unresolved hanging between us. I wasn't sure if we could repair the damage, if the cracks in our relationship were too deep to fill. But I also knew that I couldn't keep running from it. I had spent so many years avoiding conflict, trying to protect myself, but avoiding it hadn't made the pain go away. It had just allowed it to fester, to grow into something that I could no longer ignore. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking more and more about Michael's words. There were moments when I felt like I could forgive him, like maybe there was still a chance for us to rebuild what had been broken. But then I would remember the hurt, the years of neglect, and I would pull back. It wasn't that I didn't love him anymore, it was that I wasn't sure if I could ever trust him again. The betrayal of the Rolex had left a scar, one that I wasn't sure would ever heal. I found myself questioning whether forgiveness was even possible for me. Was it worth reopening old wounds, only to risk them being torn open again? Or was it better to keep my distance, to protect the peace I had fought so hard to find in my new life? And then, one day, as I was walking through the city on one of my usual solitary walks, I had an epiphany. The truth was, I didn't need their approval or validation anymore. I had spent so many years seeking it, trying to make them proud, trying to prove my worth to them. But in the end, the only person whose approval I needed was my own. I didn't need Michael or Jamie to define my worth, to determine my happiness. I had spent so many years thinking that they held the key to my future, but the truth was that I held it all along. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I sat down and wrote a letter to Michael. It wasn't an easy letter to write, and it took me several drafts, but in the end, I said what I needed to say. I told him that I appreciated his apology, that I acknowledged his desire to rebuild our relationship, but that I couldn't promise anything. I told him that I needed time, time to heal, time to trust again, and time to find my own path without the weight of my past holding me back. I wasn't closing the door on him, but I wasn't going to rush back into something that hadn't been healthy for so long. I had learned the hard way that I had to prioritize myself, that my peace of mind mattered more than pleasing others. The letter was a step toward reconciliation, but it was also a step toward protecting myself. I wasn't going to let my past continue to control me, no matter how hard it was to let go. As I sealed the envelope and put it in the mail, I felt a sense of relief. I had taken the first step toward healing, not just with Michael, but with myself. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was no longer afraid to walk it. When I finally sent the letter, I knew it was a new beginning. Whether or not Michael would ever understand, the letter was an important message to me. I was no longer trapped in the past. The life I was building now would be my own, regardless of what happened with Michael or anyone else. What mattered was that I was choosing to live fully, to live without fear of the hurt that had come before. There was no going back, and in that moment, I realized that this was exactly what I needed to heal, an affirmation that my journey forward was no longer defined by the past. The months following my move to the city had been transformative. As I settled into my new life, I found myself not only adjusting to the rhythms of urban living but also to the rhythms of my own independence. It was as if I had been given a second chance to rediscover myself, to step into a version of me that had been buried under the weight of responsibilities for so long. The apartment, though small, had become a sanctuary. The morning light that poured through the windows reminded me that I had control over this part of my life. It was mine. The city outside, alive with its own energy, no longer seemed like a distant world. It felt like the canvas I could now paint my future on. The silence that I had feared when I first arrived was now my companion, and with it came a kind of freedom I had never fully known before. I started to take long walks through the city streets, learning its different pockets and quirks. The hustle of the world around me no longer felt overwhelming, it felt invigorating. I would often stop at cafes, sit in the back corners, and watch people live their lives. Their laughter, their conversations, the occasional rush of a bus or bike passing by, it was all part of the tapestry of a world I was no longer merely existing in but actively engaging with. It was this newfound sense of freedom that allowed me to begin rethinking everything I had once known. No longer would I live for others. No longer would I be defined by the roles I had played, mother, wife, caretaker. I had been all of those things, and I had done them well, but I had also lost myself in the process. Now, for the first time in many years, I could breathe without the weight of expectations pressing down on me. The apartment itself had become a reflection of the new life I was building. I had decorated it in ways that spoke to me, surrounded myself with things that were meaningful, from books I had always meant to read to paintings I had started to work on in my spare time. I was reclaiming the space, not just physically but emotionally, as well. It was a place that was just mine, free from the history and baggage of the life I had lived in the suburbs. But as my physical surroundings transformed, so did I. It wasn't all easy, it never is. Old habits die hard, and the wounds from my relationship with Michael and Jamie, though healing, still ached. I had spent so much of my life putting others first, trying to hold everything together for them. But in doing so, I had forgotten about myself. Now, as I worked through these personal shifts, I found myself thinking back on the painful moments, the Rolex, the feeling of abandonment when Michael and Jamie sold it, the isolation I had felt when they gradually pushed me out of their lives. Those memories still stung, and I often found myself grappling with the question of whether reconciliation with them was even possible. Could I ever truly forgive them? Was it even worth it? On one hand, I wanted to rebuild the relationship with Michael, the son I had loved with all my heart. On the other hand, I couldn't just overlook the emotional scars they had left behind. The betrayal of the Rolex, the way they sold something that had meant so much to me without a thought, it was hard to move past. Still, I had learned something valuable. My peace and well-being mattered more than holding on to old wounds. I couldn't afford to let the past continue to dictate my future. Michael's apology, though painful in its sincerity, had forced me to confront this reality. I could not let my hurt define me. I could not let his actions continue to control my emotional landscape. It was time to let go, not just for him, but for me. The phone call I received from him after the family gathering had been another test of my resolve. I could sense that Michael truly wanted to repair things, but I was careful in how I responded. I wasn't going to allow myself to be swept up in the hope of a reunion that might not be sustainable. I had spent so many years trying to please him, trying to make him proud, and had been left feeling neglected and invisible. I could not return to that state. And so, I set boundaries with him, not just with my words, but with my actions. I appreciate your apology, Michael, I had told him, my voice firm yet compassionate. But there's more to this than just a simple, I'm sorry. You can't expect me to forget what's happened. I can't forget the years of neglect, the way I was pushed aside. I need time. I need to see that you truly understand what's at stake here. And I need to know that you respect me enough to give me that time. His response was not defensive, and that, in itself, was a sign of progress. It wasn't easy to let go of the idea of a perfect reconciliation, but I knew it was necessary. I couldn't expect things to go back to the way they had been. I couldn't erase the past, but I also couldn't let it be the only thing that defined my relationship with him. The same could be said for my relationship with Jamie. After the family gathering, we had spoken a few times, but it was clear that things weren't going to change overnight. She was still polite but distant, and though I could sense a slight shift in her tone, I wasn't convinced that her actions would change. I had learned the hard way not to rely on her approval or affection. What mattered was that I had come to terms with who she was, and more importantly, who I was in relation to her. As I continued to build my new life, I began to focus on strengthening myself, not for anyone else's sake, but for my own. I took up yoga, something I had always wanted to do, and began meditating in the mornings before starting my day. There was something about the stillness, the silence, that helped me reconnect with my body and mind. I wasn't just healing emotionally, I was healing physically too. The tension I had carried in my shoulders and neck for years began to loosen, and I could feel myself growing stronger in ways I hadn't anticipated. My body, too, had been neglected in the chaos of taking care of everyone else. Yoga gave me the space to remember that I was worthy of care, that my body deserved attention and love, just as much as I had given to others. I began to notice the small changes, my posture improving, my breath deepening, the lightness that started to return to my step. This physical transformation mirrored what was happening inside me. I was no longer the woman who had been swallowed up by her roles as mother and wife. I was becoming someone else, someone who could stand on her own, who could be independent, who could thrive. As my emotional and physical health improved, I started to realize something profound. I didn't need anyone else's permission to live my life. I didn't need Michael's validation, or Jamie's approval, or anyone else's recognition. I had spent too many years looking outward for reassurance, but the truth was, all I needed was within me. I had the strength to build the life I wanted, to design a future that was mine to create, without waiting for anyone else to give me the go-ahead. The power in this realization was immense. For the first time in my life, I wasn't apologizing for my needs, for my desires, for my choices. I wasn't afraid to be unapologetically myself. I had spent so much time accommodating others, living in the shadows of their expectations, that I had forgotten how to stand in the light. But now, I was taking my place in the sun. This was the true meaning of self-assertion, not only setting boundaries with others, but also acknowledging my own value. I was no longer waiting for permission to be who I was. I had already arrived, and I was finally allowing myself to occupy the space I deserved. As I sat in my apartment one evening, watching the sun set over the city, I realized something remarkable. I was finally free. Free from the shackles of my past, free from the weight of expectations, free from the need to prove myself to anyone. I was living for myself now, and that was enough. In that moment, I understood that the power to shape my future had always been mine. It wasn't in Michael's apology or Jamie's approval. It was in my ability to reclaim my life, to rewrite the narrative, and to build something meaningful for myself, regardless of what had come before. The decision to leave the house, to put a final chapter on that part of my life, had been one of the hardest I had ever made. It was symbolic. The house wasn't just a place to live, it was a physical embodiment of everything I had built with Tom, of the life we had planned together. There were so many memories tied to those walls, good, bad, joyful, and painful. It was where Michael grew up, where our family had shared countless moments. The idea of walking away from it was daunting, but I had come to realize that the house, for all the memories it held, was also keeping me tethered to a past that no longer served me. I had spent months carefully going through the boxes and closets, sorting through our belongings, each item evoking a different memory. Some brought a smile, others tears. But with every passing day, I felt myself letting go. The things in the house no longer defined me, they were just things, after all. The real meaning lay in the experiences, the love, and the lessons I had learned over the years. Those were things no one could take away from me. As I packed up my life, I realized just how far I had come. The woman I had been, the one who had held everything together for so long, was no longer the same person who stood in front of those boxes. I had evolved, I had grown, and I had found a sense of inner peace I had never known before. The quiet of my new apartment was no longer intimidating, it was comforting. It was a space where I could breathe freely, without the weight of past expectations pressing down on me. With each day that passed in the city, I could feel the distance between me and the old life I had left behind. It was like taking off a heavy coat after being out in the cold. It didn't happen all at once, but with time, I felt lighter. I could finally hear my own voice, unfiltered and unburdened by the need to please others. I didn't need anyone else's approval to define who I was or what I was capable of. The past had shaped me, but it didn't have to dictate my future. The phone call from Michael had come as a surprise, and at first, I had hesitated to pick up. I wasn't sure what he wanted or how to respond. It had been months since we last spoke, and in that time, I had made it clear to myself that I wasn't going to settle for anything less than respect and honesty in my relationships. But when I heard his voice on the other end, I could hear the sincerity in his tone. There was no defensiveness, no excuses. Just an acknowledgement of what had happened between us, and a quiet but real desire to make amends. "Mom," Michael said, his voice soft. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about how I've treated you, about the things I've done, and the things I haven't done. I want to apologize. I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't take that back, but I want you to know that I'm really sorry for the way I've acted." I didn't know how to respond immediately. Part of me wanted to reach out and forgive him, to embrace him and pretend that everything was okay. But I had learned that forgiveness was a process, not something that could be rushed. The pain from the past was still there, lingering, even though I was working hard to heal. I couldn't just sweep it under the rug and pretend that it hadn't mattered. "I hear you, Michael," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And I appreciate that you're taking responsibility for what's happened. But it's not enough just to say you're sorry. You've hurt me, and I need time to process that. I need to know that you understand the weight of what you've done." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, but I could hear the sincerity in his response. "I get it, Mom. I'm not asking for forgiveness right now. I'm just asking that you know I want to do better, to be better. I know I've failed you, but I want to fix that, if I can. I need to think about this," I said, the words coming out slower than I anticipated. "I need to think about what this means for me, for us. I'm not going to pretend that everything is okay just because you said the words. But I will consider it. I will think about what it would take to rebuild." The conversation ended on a note of uncertainty, but it was a moment of progress. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with Michael, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. It was no longer about needing his approval or validation. It was about deciding for myself whether this relationship was worth healing, worth investing in again. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting on the relationship I had with Michael, the son I had raised and loved so deeply. In many ways, he was still the little boy who had fallen asleep on my chest, the young man I had watched grow up, but he was also an adult now, one who had made choices that had hurt me. I knew that the road to rebuilding our relationship would be long, and I wasn't sure if we would ever return to what we had once been. But I had learned that I couldn't rush it. I couldn't force something that wasn't ready to be healed. What mattered now was that I had taken control of my life. I was no longer waiting for others to make decisions for me or to decide what my worth was. I had spent so many years trying to please everyone around me, Tom, Michael, Jamie, that I had lost sight of what I wanted, of who I was. But now, I had rediscovered myself. The peace I had found in my apartment, in my art, in the new friendships I had built, was something that couldn't be taken away. I wasn't asking for a perfect family. I wasn't asking for everything to go back to the way it was before. I had learned that perfection didn't exist, not in family, not in relationships, not in life. What I was asking for was respect. What I was asking for was honesty. What I was asking for was the chance to rebuild, if that was what we all wanted, but without the toxic patterns that had defined my relationships for so long. The next few weeks passed quietly. Michael reached out, sent a few more texts, and slowly, we began to rebuild our communication. It wasn't easy. We both had to learn new ways of interacting with each other, new ways of understanding the boundaries that had been crossed in the past. But I wasn't rushing. I wasn't eager to make things right, just because he wanted it. I was taking my time, processing my feelings, deciding what kind of relationship I wanted moving forward. In the meantime, I kept focusing on myself. I continued to paint, to volunteer, to grow in the ways I had been yearning for all these years. I had made the decision to move forward with my life, with or without my family's approval. I had spent too long seeking their validation, and I realized that it was time to stop waiting for it. The only validation I needed now was my own. One afternoon, as I was sitting in the local park with my sketchbook, watching the world go by, I realized something important. I had created a life that was mine. It was a life filled with meaning, with purpose, with new connections and possibilities. The family I had once envisioned didn't look the same as it had before, but that didn't mean it was any less valuable. What I had built, what I was building, was my own creation, and that was enough. The transformation I had undergone in the months since moving to the city wasn't just about adjusting to a new environment or finding a new routine. It was about redefining who I was and what I wanted from life. The quiet nights in my apartment, the soft glow of the city lights against the darkened skyline, became the backdrop for something profound, my own reclamation. I had spent so many years being defined by others, first by Tom, then by Michael and Jamie, and even by the expectations of society that seemed to demand so much from women like me. But now, in this new chapter, I realized that the only person I needed to answer to was myself. I had always thought that happiness was tied to family, the family you built, the family you nurtured, the family you fought for. But what I had learned, through the painful lessons of loss and betrayal, was that happiness is something that comes from within. It's something you create for yourself, not something you wait for from others. And though I still had love for my family, a part of me was learning to let go of the expectation that they would always be there to provide that validation. I had spent years looking for it from them, but I had come to realize that I didn't need it. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was worthy or loved. I already knew that. As I walked through the streets of the city, taking in the vibrancy of life around me, I felt a sense of pride in who I had become. I wasn't the woman I used to be, the one who had quietly accepted the role of caretaker and martyr. I wasn't the woman who had put everyone else's needs ahead of my own. I was strong, I was independent, and I was in control of my own future. It was liberating to feel this way. It was empowering. But it wasn't just about strength and independence. It was about freedom, the freedom to make my own decisions, the freedom to choose my path, and the freedom to embrace the uncertainty of life without fear. I had faced the most difficult challenges, and now I was choosing to live on my own terms. I had faced betrayal from those I loved, and I had found the courage to move on, to not let their actions define me. And though the scars remained, they no longer controlled me. I was stronger because of them, not weaker. The idea of forgiveness had taken on a new meaning for me. For so long, I had been waiting for Michael and Jamie to ask for it, for them to acknowledge the hurt they had caused. But I had learned that forgiveness isn't about waiting for others to apologize or make things right. It's about choosing to let go of the past, choosing to release the pain so that you can move forward. I had forgiven them, not because they had earned it, but because I knew it was the only way for me to heal. And as I let go of that anger, I felt lighter, freer. Michael and I had begun to rebuild our relationship, but I was no longer waiting for it to be perfect. I was no longer waiting for him to fill the gap that had been left by Tom's death, nor was I waiting for him to give me the love and validation I had so desperately craved. I had given that love to myself, and now it was about building something real, something based on mutual respect, not the expectations we had once held. There were still moments of awkwardness, still moments of silence, but we were finding our way. Slowly, we were finding a new way to be in each other's lives, not as the perfect family we once imagined, but as two individuals who had been through their own struggles and who were willing to meet each other where we were. And as for Jamie, I had come to understand that I couldn't change her, nor could I change the relationship we had. She was who she was, and that was something I had to accept. There would be no grand reconciliation, no dramatic breakthrough. But there was a quiet understanding between us, a respect that had not been there before. She had never been the type to express her emotions openly, and I had spent years resenting her for that. But I realized that it wasn't her job to fill the emotional void I had carried. It wasn't her responsibility to make me feel whole. That was my responsibility, and I had finally accepted it. The painting I had started so many months ago was almost finished. It was a large canvas, bold colors splashed together in a chaotic yet beautiful expression of what I had gone through. Each stroke of the brush, each layer of paint, represented a step in my journey, a step away from the woman who had been trapped by her past, and toward the woman who was finally free to be herself. The painting wasn't perfect. It wasn't what I had initially envisioned, but that was the point. Life isn't perfect. It's messy, and it's beautiful because of it. It was a reflection of the journey I had taken, the mistakes, the pain, the healing, and the growth. As I sat back and looked at it, I realized that the painting wasn't just about me. It was about all the women who, like me, had spent their lives putting others first. It was about every person who had ever felt invisible or overlooked. It was about finding the courage to step into the light, to claim your space, to be seen for who you truly are, without apology. The painting was my story, but it was also the story of so many others. I hung the painting on the wall of my apartment, and for the first time, I didn't look at it as something incomplete or flawed. I looked at it and saw strength. I saw resilience. I saw the woman I had become. As I stepped away from the canvas, I felt a sense of contentment settle over me. I wasn't waiting for someone to come into my life and tell me I was enough. I knew it now. I had spent so many years trying to please others, trying to make them proud, trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect daughter. But I had learned that perfection didn't exist, and the only thing that mattered was whether I was living authentically, whether I was true to myself. The phone rang again a few days later. It was Michael. He had received the letter I had written, and though he hadn't yet responded fully, there was something in his voice that told me things were changing. This wasn't just about him trying to fix things, it was about us both learning how to build a relationship on new terms, ones that didn't involve the old patterns of guilt, resentment, and unspoken expectations. As we spoke, I realized that, even if things didn't go back to the way they once were, that didn't mean they couldn't be better. We were both changing. We were both learning how to be who we were, without relying on the other to define us. And in that moment, I understood that reconciliation wasn't about perfection. It was about respect, about mutual understanding, about learning to be whole individuals first, and together, second. And that was enough. As I closed the phone call with Michael, I knew that this was only the beginning. My life had taken me on an incredible journey, and I was no longer afraid of where it would go. I had already begun to live the life I had always dreamed of, a life filled with purpose, strength, and most importantly, love. Not the kind of love that requires validation or sacrifice, but the kind of love that begins from within. The love that allows you to stand tall in your own skin, no matter what the past holds. The future was uncertain, as it always is. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready for whatever came next, knowing that I was strong enough to face it, alone or with others. I had everything I needed within me. As I sat down to write in my journal that evening, reflecting on how far I had come, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. It was as if I had crossed an invisible threshold, one that led me away from the darkness of my past and into the light of my future. I had learned to forgive not just Michael and Jamie, but myself. I had learned that the most important thing I could do was to love and care for myself, to live for myself, without fear or hesitation. And as I closed my journal for the night, I realized that the true journey was just beginning. I was no longer the woman who had been defined by her circumstances, by her relationships, or by the mistakes of others. I was a woman who had taken control, who had created a new life for herself, and who was finally free to be who she had always wanted to be.